Yeah, you can sit here. And then when we come.
Good. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Find a seat. Thank you. Hi to everyone in the room. Hi to everyone online. Thanks so much for joining us. Please come in. Please come in. Find a seat. There's still plenty of room. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining for this first of the deep dive sessions for the Social Outcomes Conference 2024. My name is Harry Brigazzi. I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the Government Outcomes Lab, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing today's session, which is titled Thinking Big, Thinking Little, Partnerships for Climate and Environmental Impact at Multiple Scales. A couple of housekeeping notes before we start. People who are in the room are welcome to join the Zoom call as well. If you'd like to see what's going on in the chat there, you can do so through the program website. But if you do, please keep your speakers muted so that we don't have audio problems in the room. In the room or online, post in the chat as we go, as you see fit. You can put questions and comments there, and we'll have plenty of time to come to those in the latter half of the session for both online and in-person questions. And you should all know as well that the session is being recorded and it's going to be publicly available afterwards. So if anybody, particularly online, if you didn't want your name or image showing on the recording, you can turn your camera off or change your name as well. So that's clear. Everyone's clear about that. I also just want to point out two of my colleagues who are in the room with me. So I've got Michael down here on the right and Franzi down here on the left. They will be helping manage the session. Michael, anyone in the room who's having any issues can come to him. And for people who are online in the Zoom chat, you'll be communicating with Franzi there. So thanks so much to them both. Turning to the theme then that we're going to be discussing here. So a huge amount of funding has been pledged towards environmental and climate programs. A lot of that is international, wealthy countries wanting to support climate resilience as part of their development packages. And there's also the domestic agenda. Actually, the Tina and Dean Woods this morning were referring to transitions to net zero and all the various innovations on different fronts, technology, contracting, governance that is required to facilitate that transformation. So the broad concern that we're discussing is the maximizing the impact of that funding, but we want to frame it in a slightly more particular way. So one route towards more effective climate spending, it won't be a surprise to anyone that we'll be talking about innovative models of financing. Things like results-based climate finance, whole finance, contracting for difference. If any of those terms are unfamiliar, they shall be elaborated in the first couple of presentations. Can these models incentivize or facilitate the kind of developments, technological innovations that are required as we transition to net zero and so on? And governments are testing various of these, trying to capture learning about what is appropriate and effective in different circumstances. And at their best, these have the potential to structure both national and international financing towards the highest impact across a range of environmental areas, from net zero to water quality, habitat improvement, and so on. Okay, so that's one side of our frame. For the other side, nevertheless, the efficacy of any solution doesn't exist in a vacuum. So it must be implemented in a specific context where it interacts with the existing environmental and social conditions. Part of the efficacy and ultimately the impact of a policy is determined by those local level factors such as community acceptance, suitability to a particular environment, and so on. So this is the creative tension that we're exploring. We have on the one hand a need to structure the effective spending of billions of dollars internationally in response to a global challenge. On the other hand, a need to incorporate local priorities and be responsive to social and environmental context. So how can policy and program design incorporate the requirements of operating between those two scales? And so I'm delighted that we have a panel lined up for you here that reflects those different requirements and allows us to stage a productive conversation about the nature of the challenge and also the opportunities for mutually beneficial learning. I'll introduce the panel very briefly. Full bios are on the program, so you can learn more there. But we'll be starting with Francis Pimenta in front of me here, who is Climate Innovation Senior Program Lead at the UK Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. We have Ben Stevens joining us from Instiglio. He's an associate partner there, and Instiglio are a non-profit advisory firm specialized in results-based financing for low and middle-income countries. We also have Benedetta Trivellato here, who is an associate professor of management at the University of Milano Bicocca in Milan. And online, joining us from the USA, we have Patsy Krieger and Creed Tomlinson, who are online with us as well. Patsy is a professor at Chatham University, where she's also chief of staff to the president. And Creed is an assistant professor at California State University, Bakersfield. It's currently 3:30 a.m. where he is, and so we commend him for joining us online today. So we'll go through the 4 presentations, just one after another. Then we'll have some panel discussion and leave plenty of time at the end for questions and comments. So do get them ready as we go along. And I shall hand straight over to Francis. I'm delighted, Francis, that we've got a perspective from one of our government departments to open the session. So why don't you begin by setting the scene such as you currently understand it. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Checking you can hear me. I think this is the right mic. So good morning. A big thank you for that introduction and for joining this important conversation at the Social Outcomes Conference. As mentioned, I'm Francis Pimenta and I work at the UK's Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, where I work under the kind of international net zero programming part of the department. And I'm here looking at some of the partnerships at that larger scale. Colleagues and panel members will look at some of the different levels that we're discussing today. And I'm particularly interested in international climate finance and innovation as part of that. And we know that there are effective outcomes-based models out there, but they're currently playing only a smaller part in that kind of climate finance space. And we believe that there are some promising examples out there, and I'll nod to something that we're developing at the moment. And also finish with some live questions to hopefully spark an ongoing conversation today. So yeah, without further ado, next few slides, please. And next, and next, thank you. So we know that now is a critical moment for global climate action and investment. And we know that urgent action is needed before 2030 to reduce emissions in line with that 1.5-degree pathway that is set out in the Paris Agreement and is so important to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And we also know those impacts will hit low and middle income countries the worst. So in order to align with this Paris Agreement's goals, it is crucial to scale up climate finance. And indeed, the public sector spending is growing to support this. So in 2022, developed countries for the first time provided and mobilized over $100 billion in climate finance that year for developing countries. And negotiations are currently underway for a new goal going forward post-2025. So that's the annual commitment from developed countries to support this. However, we know that there is continued need for support and investment. And the Songwei-Stone report this year put that out in stark terms. So you can see on the left, there is a really big call for further funding. And we know that the participation of low and middle income countries is essential. They represent a growing share of global emissions, but also as an imperative of the just transition we need to provide that support. So we know that while efforts are being made, this funding mobilization is essential. And also we need that money to work really hard and be really effective because to match the scale of the challenge that we face. Next slide, please. So we know that all sectors will need to transition to achieve those goals. And we also know that there's a crucial role for innovation in supporting those sectoral transitions. So the International Energy Agency's roadmap points out that 35% of the technologies that will be needed to achieve net zero are still not yet commercialized, and we need to support those market shifts to enable those transitions. And there are also kind of wider benefits around affordable clean energy access that support wider SDG outcomes and improved services along the way as well. And this is something that the UK government's climate finance is supporting. We work on something called the Ayrton Fund. That's something that I work on. It provides a framework for our clean energy innovation programming, and it's an important part of the picture. So how does this relate to outcomes funding? And what can we learn from the existing models out there? So next slide, please. And the next one. I wanted to point to some examples that already exist out there, and actually at some significant scale. So incentive schemes such as resource-based financing do exist and are quite well established in clean energy innovation sectors. And you might be familiar with things like feed-in tariffs, contracts for difference, incentives for the adoption of electric vehicles across the world. At the top, we've got some examples from the UK. At the bottom, some examples that involve actually led in some cases by the private sector. And these adopt a number of different results-based, outcomes-based, or elements of those, such as advanced market commitments. So there's a condition in there, we pay for the results achieved. So for example, in the EV scheme in the UK, there were grants paid so that customers in buying an electric car for the first time under a certain cap access to discount, and that was paid back to manufacturers upon the sale, proof of the sale of vehicles. So there are lots of examples, and they have been really effective in generating change. So I think the feed-in tariffs for renewables, when introduced in 2010, I think the landscape was there was about 95 megawatts of solar panels installed in the UK, and 9 years later it was something like 13.4 thousand megawatts just in solar. So these sectors are developing fast, and some of these mechanisms have been really effective as incentives. So we've got a range of examples out there, and I think high-income countries across the piece have been largely adopting mechanisms like this. So is this not the norm? Is this something that everyone is doing? That's my next question. And next slide, please. So we know that there is a promising approach, and schemes like this can work. And they've been picked out in the literature as cost-effective and achieving meaningful results and at scale. And they can help us address barriers that are market barriers or non-market barriers to the adoption of these kind of critical solutions. However, some research has pointed out that largely international climate finance, when we support developing countries, we're largely looking at those ex-ante upfront cost support type projects. So largely things like loans and other kind of project-based finance. So results-based financing still represents only a small share of climate finance out there. And is this a problem? It potentially could be a problem, because if you're measuring outcomes, you're also gathering data on what it is that makes them effective and what are the different routes to the solutions. So it does build in tests. So I think the evidence is pointing that this is a potentially valuable complement to existing climate finance offers. And there are clearly a range of things that we can be doing to support the scale of the challenge that exists. So yes, it's a timely opportunity to test, validate, and scale what we're doing. Next slide, please. And so there already are some examples out there in the climate finance space. And UK and other funders have already started supporting some climate and energy related initiatives across the globe. So we've got examples here around what the World Bank is doing, and quite a lot in the forest protection space around the REDD+ models. But clearly there are other sectors that do need to change as well. The UK has been involved in funding a number of initiatives in clean energy innovation, such as the Global Leap Awards, funding the development of prizes and rollout support schemes for off-grid appliances, such as things like solar fridges, solar water pumps, things that are innovation areas that don't necessarily exist and are kind of led in some of those areas of the globe that have really massive R&D budgets. So there's opportunity to see kind of what innovative solutions come out of communities across the world. The UK has also supported a number of different mechanisms, some of which are kind of supporting things like mini-grid applications, so enhanced paying for new mini-grid connections, paying for energy access outcomes, but also paying for things like agriculture innovation and paying for things like reducing emissions in the rice growing sector, for example, under the Ag Results Programme, or paying for things like green premiums on construction in developing countries. So there's a range of different programs out there that adopt elements of this kind of outcomes-based approach, at least. So we know that there is a growing picture and there's a lot that we can already learn from. And I think as a next slide, I just wanted to point to the next one, an emerging area that my department is looking at. If we can shift one more. So currently looking in my department at designing something called the Climate Innovation Pool Facility. This is designed as a large new program, and at COP28 we announced our intention to develop this to incentivize the development and early deployment of innovative clean energy and climate mitigation solutions in and for developing countries. This is a concept that is still in progress and we're still working through it and subject to kind of all the final approvals. But largely speaking, we've got a number of objectives. The first bucket of objectives looks at developing and deploying the solutions and involving those kind of market tests to see what are the solutions that people actually want, and how can we kind of help them gain that foothold in markets so that cleaner products are viable and accessible options for those who want them. But the second bucket of objectives is all about testing and improving the knowledge of this approach for climate innovation technology and enhancing knowledge and capability. So what is it that allows us to kind of implement these schemes effectively? So we hope the program will demonstrate a portfolio of different projects using different mechanisms across different types of technologies in different countries, and to draw together knowledge on how they're going and what we can learn across that piece. So here's an example on the screen of, if you wanted to work on, let's say, an innovative model for let's say, electric minibuses, or the best model out there for an e-moto for low-income drivers in a particular country that kind of beats everything that exists in the market, you could look at setting some incentives and targets around that, looking at how you could scale it up, reduce emissions. But there are some also kind of wider outcomes there that could be targeted as well around improved livelihoods, growth, development benefits, and accelerating this pace of change. So for my final slide, we're keen to learn from others. And so I've got one more, please. A few questions that are live in my mind and might be live in the minds of others here. So I'm really interested to learn from other sectors who are perhaps a little bit more advanced with this model. What works, what has worked well in the social outcome space, and what's common and different across sectors. What are the kind of design mechanisms and also kind of design principles? We spoke earlier about engaging people and communities that helps these schemes be effective, and what is important about the local context in designing and understanding how they work. How do we best engage users and understand their needs and adapt solutions to capture those? And if we have a really effective scheme and we want to scale it up and replicate it and take it somewhere else, what do we need to bear in mind if you're trying to translate something from one context to another? Metrics is always an important part of the conversation. Are we measuring and prioritizing the right things? And learning communities, do we have the right structure for learning in this space around climate environment so that collectively we can kind of harness that greater sum of the parts that we're all working on. So those are sort of my questions to myself and to you, and looking forward to the discussion.
That's great. Thanks so much, Francis, and great to finish there with the learning agenda. Hopefully over the next 2 days, we'll be getting some responses to these and indeed on this panel. So Ben, why don't I hand over to you to take us for the next presentation.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Francis. Thanks, Harry. Nice to be here with you all. Good morning. Yeah, so my name's Ben, Associate Partner in Stiglio, and yeah, from an organisation called Instiglio, and we've been over the last couple of years working on these topics as well, very much in line with Francis's conversation just now and the presentation. So on the next slide, it just gives you a sense of what we're going to cover. I think last year we started a little collaboration with DESNZ and did some background research on these topics, and I've been thinking about the potential for pool finance, the sort of the value add and the need for it, so similar to Francis's content just now. And then since that time, we've also been digging into some more in-depth analysis of the potential for what this would look like on the ground, trying to put some flesh on the bones of the concepts. So I'll be mentioning a bit more about that today. And I'll also try to conclude with a little reflection on some of Francis's questions that have also been on our mind over the last little while. So in the next slide, we mention again, very similar to Francis's opening, but this great opportunity of growing climate finance, the great need for more climate finance, and fortunately there has been growth here, but also recognising that there needs to be much more financing if we're going to have a chance of tackling the climate challenge, but then climate crisis, but then that funding also needs to be deployed as effectively as possible. And this is the questions that I think are all familiar with at this conference, of how to make sure that dollars turn to results. And of course, there's nowhere that's more important than on climate, given the scale, the emergency, and the scarcity of resources relative to the immensity of the need and the challenge the globe faces. It's therefore concerning that there's quite limited evidence on the effectiveness of climate spending in many contexts, and the available evidence points to heterogeneity in terms of the returns to that spending. You're often getting very different results from climate spending in terms of mitigation outcomes, and it's going to be vital that we can really ensure that each dollar is being converted to climate results at the greatest possible rate. This topic is slowly making its way onto the agenda alongside the questions of level of funding. There are questions now on the agenda at COP and other places around the effectiveness of spending, and of course the UK government looking at opportunities here. And that's something that we're trying to respond to as well at Instiglio, coming up with ideas, and hopefully with this community here, of how we can play a role at bringing in new innovative approaches that really focus on driving this shift as quickly as possible. So on the next slide, we talk about pool finance, results-based pool finance as one approach to doing that. And I think very simply, and I think Francis has described it well, but very simply, if you just keep clicking through, a bit of animation there, this is very similar to what we talk about in this sort of environment at this conference and the work that many of you are doing. That this is all about really defining the results you're after and then creating incentives to pursue those results. In this case, that's about creating incentives for the market to respond to. And I hope these concepts are very familiar to those of you thinking about results-based financing, results-based approaches, outcome-based approaches, the focus on incentives and driving action through those incentives. If you keep clicking, the next point, thank you, the next point mentions that, yeah, there's some precedent for this work, some points around this has been applied to health, and we've talked about the meningococcal vaccine. The COVID vaccine was also driven in its development so rapidly by creating these incentives, by governments stumping up and saying we're going to provide incentives to make sure this is deployed as quickly as possible. And yeah, as Francis mentioned, there's also the Frontier Advanced Market Commitment, trying to provide incentives to the market to develop carbon capture technologies that can remove carbon from the air for about $100 a tonne, led by Alphabet and other organisations. Then, yeah, and I think, again, as in the previous conversation, there's some strong parallels here. And we're using new terminology, advanced market commitments, pool finance, results-based approaches. But this is all really about creating market signals, and this is very familiar to economists and policymakers who've been working on climate issues for the last 30 years and beyond. And it's similarly manifest in things like tax credits, cap and trade schemes, subsidies, similar to those being used in Europe, UK, US, or like the Inflation Reduction Act, where they've tried to incentivize solar, wind, etc., in the technology development and deployment. So in the next slide, and I can skip through this one, I think we've covered enough of this context. But yeah, so then to talk about what we've been doing and trying to explore this, we've been working with a very wonderful range of partners, thinking through these topics and thinking how we can flesh out these ideas and bring this to fruition. And some of this, maybe hopefully relates to Francis's presentation earlier about the UK government's work, but other partners are also interested in this. And actually just yesterday talking with like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, a lot of interest and excitement around these ideas and the World Bank and others. And I think, one point also here is that lots of these actors and like the World Bank and others, have growing climate portfolios. As we heard in the last presentation, they have a growing focus on results-based climate finance and related modalities. And they're related to that then are digging into climate pool finance as well. Instiglio has been working on sort of a range of these different results-based approaches to climate finance, but today we're just focusing very much on pool finance as well. So in the next slide, so the one topic that's really come through over the last couple of years of analysis, where a really exciting and potentially highly impactful topic is cement. We've been looking into this. Maybe it's worth keeping in mind that one of the biggest sources of global emissions is cement. About up to 10% of global emissions. That's maybe 3 times the amount from all aviation or shipping. And it's going to be also a particularly pertinent topic in low and middle income countries that are continuing to grow in populations and urbanization and in building. And, this is illustrated in one particular case of Nigeria, sub-Saharan Africa's largest cement producer. And so we've been digging into this, trying to think, is there a potential to respond to the emissions by creating incentives for shifting away from emission-intensive practices? So on the next slide, we show that fortunately and excitingly, there are some technologies available that could help bend that emissions curve and could get us on a lower emissions curve in a country like Nigeria or other lower middle income countries. There's technologies like clinker substitution, but also alternative fuels that are available right now and that are also viable, markedly viable to the market. So they could be adopted and deployed right now. There's other technology, at least over the next 5-10 years at great scale, and just on the previous slide, and could reduce emissions by up to 50%. There's other technologies as well, like energy efficiency, and then new technologies like carbon capture, usage and storage. Those are a bit further out and cost a lot more. They're not really viable on the market, but perhaps in the medium term, they could play a bigger role in low and middle income countries. But at least we have things available right now. And on the next slide, you might be thinking, well, if they're available and they work in the market, why are they not being deployed? And that's the key question, and the question we're trying to respond to here. And we've identified some sort of basic market barriers that are inhibiting the development and deployment of these technologies in low and middle income countries like Nigeria. And we can talk about these in a lot of detail, but I'll just mention a few points briefly. There's topics around underdeveloped supply chains, market risks, uncertainty from industry and consumers of whether they want people messing with their cement. There's some issues around policy alignment, and there's some cost involved in this transition. It's not a costless exercise to revamp, refit your plants to take on these new technologies. So on the next slide, we're coming up with a proposal of how to respond to this, and this is a mechanism that some of you might find familiar. It's around paying for results, basically providing a green premium to cement makers to provide to the market low emission intensity cement. And we think that in maybe a 5-year time horizon, you could set up a contract that pays, set up the contract quickly, and then on that time horizon, reduce emissions by about 15 to 20%, maybe for about 20% of the market with a transaction size of up to about $20 million, paying about $5 to $15 tons per $5 to $15 per ton of emissions mitigated. And that would depend a little bit on scale and the setup, and there's still some details to work through. But the exciting thing here is that we think by providing these incentives, you would shift the market over about a 5-year period. Companies would bear the costs of that transition, and then they would stay there with the lower emission technologies, because, as I mentioned, these are market viable technologies right now, similar to like solar or wind or whatever, where you've seen a dramatic reduction in costs over time, that you're going to have that as a more sustainable practice going forward. And then we also hope that can be then uptaken and adopted by the market in the future. So maybe just jumping through the next, my last slide, and maybe I can leave the last slide if we just keep going. We can skip this one. And then the last slide, or we could get to these in a bit more detail in the conversation as well. Harry might cut me off. But I think also reflecting on, for those of you engaged in the practice of thinking about how to drive effectiveness from government spending and outcomes-based approaches, we've been thinking a little bit about some of the similarities and differences that you might find engaging on whether you're looking at social topics or climate topics. Frankly, I think there's a lot of similarities. Basically, the rationale and the theory, the focus on incentives, but also innovation, and even relating to the keynote around collaborations and partnerships is also very relevant. And then you've got also basically very familiar design features as well. Things like pricing, things like verification of metrics, defining of metrics, is all very similar, parallel conversations and parallel topics. Though there are some big differences as well. The focus on markets and shifting market dynamics is a different topic that maybe will get a little bit less focus from the rest of the proceedings in the next couple of days. And then there's also some real differences in the details of the verification and pricing. There's actually a whole sort of parallel world of climate emissions verification, pricing, and approaches that we're sort of trying to bring together in this outcomes-based approach as well. So looking forward to further conversation, but thank you very much for the time today. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks so much, Ben. So now we're going to begin the transition towards the consideration of the local context. Maybe where's the role of civil society actors, local government as part of the development of solutions. So I'm very pleased to hand over to Benedetta to begin us on the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Harry, and thank you all for being here. My name is Benedetta Tribellato. I'm from the University of Milano Bicocca in Italy. Actually, the work I'm going to present today is part of a wider project, which is directed by Jakob Torfing and Eva Sorensen of Roskilde University. So that's why you see a number of additional names here. And next, please. This wider project is called Go Green, Governing the Green Transition. And the project explores the conditions for successful co-creation of green transitions by comparing 36 case studies from 29 countries and analyzing the governance factors that condition successful co-creation of green solutions. So basically, each of these cases is a project involving a number of different actors from different sectors: private, public, civil society, even individual citizens. We are considering 16 governance factors, which are listed here. I'm aware this is not very easy to read, but somehow they can be divided into 3 macro categories in terms of structural, strategic, and tactical operational governance factors. Next, please. Now, the question we are asking in this specific work is, does the nature of the initiator matter for the success of green co-creation processes? Now, why this question? We were somehow expecting that most of our cases were initiated by public actors. And actually from the project, we realized that 45% of the projects were actually initiated by a non-public actor. So either a private company or a civil society actor. So our next question was, is it more likely that the success of the project is going to be there if the initiator is a public actor or a non-public actor? Because in a way, it can be argued that the public actor is critical for success as initiator because it provides legitimacy, credibility, commitment, and it facilitates sustainability of effort by all the different actors over the long run. On the other hand, it can also be argued that a non-public actor is more important for success because it's going to be quicker, more flexible, less bounded by political or institutional constraints, or it may also step in when the public actor cannot or doesn't want to support the project. So whether one or the other matters more, it's likely to depend on how the nature of the initiator and a set of other conditions interact. And given the nature of also our project, we analyzed how the nature of the initiator interacts with a selection of governance factors. Next, please. So what we did is to use a qualitative comparative analysis, which looks at the multiple combinations of a certain set of conditions that can lead to the same outcome. In our case, success of the project. So multiple combination can be seen as also as different paths or different recipes to reach a certain outcome. So we used QCA to explore how the nature of the initiator combines with 5 governance factors, which are 2 tactical operational, engagement of all the relevant and affected actors and facilitative leadership, 2 strategic factors, use of platforms. These can be not only digital, but also physical platforms, and presence of blended financing, and then 1 structural governance factor, perception of the severity of the biosphere conditions. Next, please. So these are the results. This is a way of displaying them, which is somehow common to qualitative comparative analysis. Basically, we got 4 different paths to success. And here, the full circles mean that the condition is present. Empty circle means that the condition is absent, and an empty cell means that that condition is not relevant to reach the outcome. So it can be or present or not, but is not relevant to reach the outcome. So basically, what we see here is that we have only 1 path, number 4, where the presence of the public actor combines with other conditions in order to reach success. But we also have 2 paths, number 2 and number 3, where the initiator is not a public actor, so it's either private or civil society, and which combined with the other conditions leads to success. And we also have 1 path, number 1, where the nature of the initiator is not relevant to reach success as long as these other conditions are present and interact. Next, please. Next again, actually. So you might wonder, okay, this is all very abstract, but how does it work in practice? So this is one case, one example of configuration of the path number 3. It's the Denmark's Sky Clean project, which aims to scale the use of pyrolysis, which basically consists, this probably many of you already know, but I discovered, in heating in absence of oxygen in order to split biomass into green biogas and clean and stable biochar. This project was initiated by a private entrepreneur, Henry Stiesdal, who actually saw an opportunity in pyrolysis technology, which was actually developed originally by an institutional actor, the Danish Technical University. The project involves a variety of different actors from public and the private sector, but interestingly, there's very little direct involvement of the most affected actors, farmers. This is a case where blended financing is very important. Stiesdal has invested and is investing a lot, but a lot of the financing, lots of funds also come from public sources. The National Technical University, grants from the national government, and also EU funds. And here also we see a key leadership role, which is played by Henrik Stiesdal, though also in contrast with many other projects that we have seen in this Go Green project. This is more a traditional and directive leadership role rather than facilitative or collaborative distributed leadership, which we have seen in other projects. Next, please. So if we go back to our question, is the public actor as initiator critical for success? And the answer is not necessarily, because our solution, the result of our QCA analysis, shows 4 paths where only one actually shows the public actor as initiator. 2 paths have a non-public actor as initiator, and the last one actually leads to green transition irrespective of the public, private, and or civil society nature of the initiator. Of course, as long as the other conditions that come out from the analysis are present and interact with each other. And also, we saw that other expectations may not be fulfilled. For instance, one would expect that inclusion of all relevant and affected actors in the collaborative process is critical for success. But actually, this is not necessarily the case. It is the case in paths number 1 and 2, but not this is not the case in the 2 other paths. So basically, it depends on how the selected conditions combine and interact in leading to a green transition. Thank you.
So much better. Right, I don't know if you can. Okay, thanks so much. Brilliant. Thanks, Benedetta. We're going now to our final presentation. So this is to Patsy and Creed, who are both joining us online. So please take it away, guys, for the last presentation.
Okay, good morning. Thank you. So in our presentation, we are looking at modeling community accountability behind insider stakeholders, capturing public voice in developing policy for net zero greenhouse gas economy. That's a mouthful, but in short, what we're doing is presenting a democratic innovation model to include stakeholder and public voice in the creation of public policy outcomes. I would just like to say, building on the prior 3 presentations, we are looking at innovation, and we're looking at public actors and community voice as essential for the implementation of public policy driven by community, which is a little different than what Benedetta approached, but I think building on the slide that she and her team presented, there is a need for inclusive engagement at all levels. Next slide, please. So our framing of our agenda is to look at our democratic innovation. We'll present the need for community engagement as essential here, and our slide is out of place that we're looking at a place-based model. And then Creed will present our conceptual model. And here is pictured an emission in the southern San Joaquin Valley in California. And our work is in conjunction with the Lawrence Livermore National Lab of the U.S. Department of Energy. We saw an opportunity to include public and stakeholder voice and develop this model to alleviate tensions between fossil fuel advocates and environmental justice advocates who seek to punish fossil fuel advocates to develop a public policy solution that everyone can agree with. Next slide, please. So our framing basically is to present our community accountability and scientific responsiveness model. So we're going beyond scientific messaging to the communities to say, this is what should be done. Instead, we seek to build greater accountability to the public to develop public policy acceptance and innovation, where community at large can be involved in the co-creation of this model. Next slide, please. So community engagement in our model is a 5-step approach that includes both stakeholder, those are insiders to the process and have that are invested in the process, as well as public participation. We look at both participatory and deliberative practices. And deliberative practices look at the wisdom of the community to seek their own solutions in a place-based arena. So we're looking to the future to create social outcomes. All right, over to you, Creed, to look at the model. Next slide, please.
All right, so as mentioned, this is kind of came from work done from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, specifically the Roads to Removal report, which looked at solutions at the county level in the United States. So we're talking about this national scale, global scale problem with solutions that need to be implemented locally. And one of the challenges that they run into is this clash between insiders, the oil industry, and environmental justice advocates. And so trying to move beyond that clash to get local solutions implemented successfully without as many legal challenges it is kind of the motivation here. So in step 1 of this model, we're looking at developing and sending out baseline surveys, random sample of general public, as well as stakeholders, to get kind of a baseline idea of the understanding of the problem, understanding of the potential solutions, risks and benefits associated with the potential solutions that are laid out for that local community. And then being able to actually compare what the general public thinks and how they view the problem with the attitudes of the stakeholders, and see if there are similarities, disparities there. From this baseline survey, using that to inform civic assemblies, also often called citizens assemblies. So these are a body of citizens that come together to deliberate on a given issue, provide a set of recommendations, options, or collective decision to the body that convenes the assembly. And then these decisions are used to ultimately develop policy solutions. So traditionally, these civic assemblies bring in scientific, technical information about the problem, about solutions, and have citizens work together to come up with solutions that they believe would work locally. This model allows for the addition of the community views in the first place, so that what the Citizens Assembly comes up with is able to be kind of nested or couched in the values that the community already has. So from there, we have this post-civic assembly action, where using these outcomes from the civic assembly, be conducting host surveys, focus groups of those who are traditionally invested in that policy arena, and allowing for feedback to the citizen assembly. So step 2 and step 3 can be an iterative process where the citizen assembly reconvenes after getting feedback from those stakeholders. It also allows for getting a broader understanding of the acceptance, both from policy elites and the community, of what the citizens assembly comes up with. From there, a public convening where there's an educational component that presents the scientific information, the technical information, as well as the solutions that have come from the Citizens Assembly and the surveys, that allows for kind of a broader educational or a broader level of education to be reached that gets deeper into the place-based component of decarbonization in the current case. Excuse me. So then from there, move to step 5, public outcomes, where would ultimately be produced community action, potentially educational forums, public-private partnerships, community benefit agreements, anything along those lines. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So, like I said, this model, nothing is necessarily revolutionary as far as each of the steps are concerned, but we're taking these disparate parts of the local policymaking process and pulling them together to sort of create a coherent picture, a coherent framework that reduces policy conflict in later stages. Oftentimes what happens, particularly in the United States, you have the, in this case, oil industry and environmental justice advocates fighting. Eventually, some policy is or is not implemented, some action is taken by private organizations, and then there are legal challenges and nothing happens over a period of time. So the idea here is to reduce the reliance on the legal system to allow or disallow some activity, create learning communities within the local community, especially among marginalized communities. We end up in a lot of these conflicts dealing with where is siting going to occur, and this ends up impacting marginalized communities who don't have a voice traditionally, and this allows those marginalized communities to have a voice, to also create a system where not only decarbonization solutions can be found, but also just a democratic process that is more inclusive of the community as a whole to be implemented kind of long-term for more effective community solutions. And that's all we have. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Patsy and Creed. So that's the presentations then. You've seen the sort of spectrum of the actors and scales that we're talking about. Tina Nabachi this morning was talking about hyperlocal to international and the need to work across them. I think we've seen that here from individuals up. We'll be coming to questions from the audience and discussion comments very soon. I just want to begin, though, with a couple of questions with the panel. I wonder, Francis, if I can start with you, having set out a perspective from the government, putting some questions to our panel and indeed the audience. If you wanted to reflect at all on what you've heard, pick out anything that particularly resonated.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really rich discussion, a lot of different perspectives and approaches discussed, and there's a host of kind of initiatives and practices that are developing kind of outside of this room. I think we pointed to so many examples already. I think one of the things that I took away was that obviously action can come from so many levels, and perhaps kind of drawing on kind of what Patsy and Creed you were talking about, there is a groundwork to be established around what people actually want and need, and kind of when we think about these big environmental and climate outcomes, There are so many kind of views and concerns and different stakeholders who have to be part of that transition, have a value to add to it and different perspectives and are affected in different ways in those transitions. So dialogue is essential. Having that kind of basis of understanding who the community are and how they're impacted is so important as a starting point. And then Benedetta, I was thinking when you were talking about it, it's clear that it doesn't need to just be the public actors who take action first. The initiatives can come from anywhere. They can come from the bottom up, and they can be very effective. And kind of you can have that cross-pollination of ideas between, you know, research institutes and entrepreneurs and community members, and that actually is probably where you get the most effective outcomes when you take them forward. And then I guess maybe kind of coming to some of the practices that Ben and I were talking about. I was reflecting on one of the things that was mentioned in the opening session around, I think we were all encouraged to problematize the orthodoxies that we work within and why do we care about outcome models and what's important here. And I was thinking, well, we often, and maybe in my presentation, I talked about effectiveness, cost effectiveness, efficacy, and that's one layer. But actually, maybe one of the attractive things that came up in these presentations was the openness that some of these mechanisms offer. So maybe there's a subtext around innovation and the fact that some of these models offer a certain openness to for various different actors to participate and offer up solutions and different ways of getting to an outcome. So that might be another reason why we're interested in engaging with this model. But those are some of the thoughts that came to me. And clearly there's a whole range of different actors who have a part to play.
Brilliant, thanks, Frances. And I also wanted to ask each panelist to respond in turn, if you would. The intersection with social issues has already been apparent with some of the discussion so far. And actually, Ben, in your presentation, you were talking about what characteristics are shared with social programs or using cross-sector partnerships for social programs rather than environmental, and what the differences are. So I wondered if I could ask the panelists to respond to the question of what is unique about cross-sector partnerships specifically for environmental or climate policy, and what is transferable either to or from other policy areas. Benedetta, you look like you're thinking. Can I come to you first? You got about 3 seconds, but hopefully that's sufficient.
No, that's fine. Yes, no, I was thinking because probably my expression was linked to the fact that in our Go Green project, all projects are somehow related to, they're all aimed at finding local solutions, or better, locally constructed solutions to problems that are somehow linked to climate or environmental problems. So if it's all the partnerships, all the co-creation processes that we're studying are definitely related to environmental problems. And we have seen that in almost all projects, the perception of the severity of biosphere conditions has been declared by the interviewees as a very strong motivating factors to collaborate and to overcome obstacles and problems. And actually, then I'll come back to your question, because I think something which comes to my mind, which is very interesting and is linked to something that Ben said. I was struck by, at some point he said, if options or solutions are there, why they're not being deployed, right? Because we have seen also in our project that sometimes obstacles and come from directions that would not be expected. Mm-hmm. And this goes on to the clouds, all the cloud mess that we discussed. And I'll just give you a very somehow unexpected example from actually an Italian case. where we had in our project, where we had a renewable energy community which was being built, which one would think, well, there's nothing really very problematic once all the details are set. But actually, this project encountered problems because there was some, even if renewable energy communities, as you know, are very much promoted by the European Union and also at the national level by national governments. At some point in our case, there was a delay by the Italian national government in promulgating some legislation so that local level actors, especially municipalities, were somehow expecting these regulations, and therefore they would not proceed with their projects. And in the end, this particular project was very much delayed, and I'm not sure it will be brought to its end because of this. So I guess this goes back to what Mario Calderini was saying this morning about the importance also of legal implications that are going to be to have influence. So going back to your question, do we see some of these dynamics that are specific to the environmental context? Well, or some of these solutions or some of these obstacles, I believe some are specific. For sure, the awareness that solutions need to be found fast or as fast as possible is very strong when we talk about climate and environmental change and so on. But I'm sure that many other drivers of a similar force are also very strong also in other sectors. So the answer inevitably is probably a bit of both.
Great, thanks so much.
At least from my point of view.
Thanks. Patsy and Creed, would you like to come in on this question as well?
Yeah, I'll just say something first, and I'm going to turn it to Creed. So I'll just tell you the U.S. context, which I think is important to what we're doing, but I think to talk about Tina Nabachi's statement about we need hyper-local solutions to global problems, we provide a model to capture insider voice, stakeholders, and public voice. So our model came about as the result of an opportunity through a meeting at the California State University, Bakersfield, when the Lawrence Livermore Lab and that university signed a memorandum of understanding for work around carbon containment solutions. And the Lawrence Livermore National Lab and the Department of Energy have presented a report, Roads to Removal of Carbon, which is on a national road tour itself. And there was an understanding by experts that if we present the science, that's enough and it will be understood. And so the context in Bakersfield is sort of the end of manufacturing in the globe. This is a community that's the largest oil and gas producer in the United States. And so we understood that a different lens was needed, that, an example to policy creation needed here to be hyper-local, with the understanding that there should be a community well-being and an economic well-being lens because of the fear of the energy transition and what this meant to the community. And the United States Department of Energy requires that in any action taken in communities funded by that department, that 20% of all funding needs to include community voice. And there was, I'll use a term that has just come out in Marjan Isassi's book, Activated Citizen, a lot of voice insecurity. There were two actors who were in great tension, the fossil fuel advocates and the environmental justice advocates, and they were taking the full conversation.
Mhm.
And in a meeting, which you looked like it was going to come to fisticuffs, I attended this meeting, and then Creed attended a different meeting. We saw these actors see that they had no voice. And so our model presents a scalable, replicable model that is hyperlocal for a larger policy change, to understand that there is a need, to answer your question, to bring in not just the policy insiders, but to listen to the wisdom of the community, through an iterative process, to co-create voice. And the leaders in the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which is one of 13 national energy labs, saw that scientific messaging wasn't alone. Just because the science works doesn't mean that the community, will adopt the policy that is going to take away high-paying jobs that you can have when you leave it, or what we call high school, when you can be a high school dropout and make a six-figure salary. So this is deeper than the science. This is about community adoption. The other issue in the United States is that with a recent United States Supreme Court decision, government agencies have lost the final say and discretion. And by having community voice adopted, to the point also made about legal ramifications, is that, it can present lawsuits by insiders who want to have their point of view there. So we believe that there needs to be this iterative process with stakeholders and public voice to create a hyperlocal solution. And I went over time on that, and I'll just turn to Creed to have him give a different perspective. And
yeah, just real quick to add on that, I think one of the sort of fascinating things, especially in the context that we're kind of looking at this in, we have pushback against this scientific communication, and we traditionally think that pushback is coming from the oil and gas industry, right? And it is. They have this pushback of, you're trying to change our way of life. That's a statement that has been made. But then at the roads to removal report, and looking at communities and getting community feedback, there is pushback there against the scientific information, because they are marginalized communities. Members of those communities are seeing themselves as outside of the process. And so you have pushback against solutions, against this idea even of these cross-sector partnerships, because the lack of inclusion. And so these partnerships may work functionally to achieve whatever goals, but they are not accepted by the local communities. And then the communities end up more distrustful of any government action or any private action aimed at reducing the thing that they themselves are acknowledging are a problem, but they see the benefits accruing outside of their communities, and all the negatives accruing within those communities. So I think that lack of accountability to the public, it actually creates a long-term hindrance to the ability of cross-sector partnerships from working ultimately. So I think that creates an extra kind of layer of challenges.
That's great. Thanks both. So it's possibly actually a false distinction to make between the social and the environmental. Maybe the premise of the question is wrong. In fact, it's the environmental problems are already social, and we ought to approach them in that way. I wonder if we're able to skip to the questions from the audience, just because please, if you do have something to come back to on that, since you...
Yeah, well, just maybe 4 quick points.
Yeah.
I think on this, I just pick up on your point as well. Firstly, on the distinction between social and climate or environmental outcomes. I think there are some differences, right? Mitigation results. This is about measuring carbon in the air, and it doesn't have any direct translation into social outcomes immediately. Eventually it will. So that isn't a difference. But then all the projects that we're looking at as well on these technology fronts, and Francis is looking, they do all have social outcomes as well attached to them. And that's critical for the programs that we're talking about, like FCDO, DESNES, but EBRD, all the partners, World Bank, working on these topics. They're always pursuing social outcomes as well. So different technologies, like we talked about, e-mobility, clean cooling, these things all have direct social benefits as well. Cement's a little bit lighter on social benefits, though there are some of those there as well. Secondly, I think, as I mentioned earlier, like there is just this focus in terms of similarities and differences. I mean, there are a lot of similarities on the approaches being taken here, focusing on innovation, incentives, results, trying to drive towards that is always going to be critical. And I think that's a strong parallel and commonality that we have on these topics. Thirdly, I think also, and picked up a lot by the last two presentations, this aspect of community and collaboration and engagement cuts across and what's required for any of the climate projects as well. And so definitely what we're talking a lot about, it can sound a bit more technical and drier and more we're talking about companies and international finance, but it does still come down to things happening on the ground with people and communities. And so that's, I think, really important to keep in mind. And I think that also just links to the fourth point, which I think is a bit of a theme for the conference as well. So these points on, partnerships, the messier ideas. Again, like I think this one, the presentations of me, Francis and I, our presentations, do talk about things like paying for mitigation outcomes. They can sound quite technical, quite abstracted, a little bit like Eleanor's clocks from the earlier conversation. But I think there's still very much issues of, elements of clouds in these topics, given that, again, we're talking about local contexts, organizations, we're working with businesses and communities to produce these results, governments. And so I think it's great to be at the conference and hear these sorts of nuances and sort of caveats to not get too caught up in your clocks, but also remembering the cloudier aspects of these topics. But thanks, Harry.
Thanks, Ben. And I should be further than Francis if you want to have any reflections.
I would absolutely support what was just said. And I think maybe the one other thing is that the one thing that's really evident here is just the accelerated rate of change, both the policy, like regulatory environment, and also the technologies that are coming on board really fast. So you can design whatever scheme you want to, but those clouds are rapidly shifting and schemes need to be updated and flex and adapt to the kind of ever-changing landscape in those both fronts.
Brilliant, thanks. So any questions from the audience then? You can address it to a specific panelist, you can address it to the whole panel. Michael's got the microphone, there's one in the center there. And for people online, please post questions in the chat as well. We're able to relay your questions to the panel too.
Thanks to the panel. Is this working? Not sure it is. Yeah. Very, very interesting. I think on this last point, the sort of distinction or otherwise between social and climate outcomes, and maybe can be considered in the context of adaptation, and we didn't hear a lot about that in this presentation, but surely climate finance has to be directed towards adaptation goals. But the sort of question I had is, there's this paradox in my experience as a project developer between scale and learning. Investors are always looking for scale. Innovation doesn't happen at scale. Learning doesn't happen at scale. So how do you kind of bridge that gap? If this is a bell curve, understandably, most of the money is going in the middle, but how do you get money out to the margins? Because those long shots are where the real learning is. And as we heard this morning, with these cloudy problems, adaptive problems, learning is at a premium. So where are the opportunities to really drive the learning? Thanks.
Thanks so much. Benedetta, you were talking a little about where the original innovation might come from.
Yes. On the other hand, I'm afraid I will not be able to answer what I understand, if I understand correctly, is the main answer. That is, how do you scale some of the beneficial dynamics that happening? For instance, we've seen a lot at the local level. For instance, we've seen a lot of learning, reflection and really what also Tina was talking about this morning, like putting different perspectives and interests and needs together. Although all the projects that we've studied are admittedly at the local level. So I definitely agree that scaling what is developed at the local level at higher levels without losing all this, to be honest, I cannot answer. I hope they will be better.
Yeah, okay. I mean, maybe just... It's a great question. And I think, yeah, I mean, so it's also a big topic on adaptation as well. And yeah, you're right. We haven't talked about that a lot today. It could be another, maybe next year, a whole thing. But then on the mitigation side, if we are talking about mitigation and just on that point, I mean, you're right, like this, I mean, scale is critical and that's like the main game. But if you think about, the process of, say, just decarbonizing the global economy, basically that's just a process of switching technologies across lots of technologies. And there's probably like top 5 or 10 that you really want to focus on, and we can do that right now at scale. And that's basically, energy source. And that's where you want to just be scaling up massively, like solar and wind. And then there's things also like EVs and stuff where this is, at scale already now and just needs to be pumped out at scale. There's no real more innovation and no innovative financing required in those areas. These are well-known technology, and we just got to keep driving down the cost curve on those technologies. This is the big picture look. But then, yeah, there are, and say particularly as Francis mentioned, like there's been not so much work on this in low and middle income countries. And there's, another 60, 80 technologies. So you're going to have to transition all of these technologies if you're going to go towards net zero, as we need to do. And that's where you do need to have a little bit more innovation. And I think the mechanism that Francis talked about is about trying to do that. I mean, that's I think it's been published around like $200 million or so for that sort of exercise. That's sort of big in social outcomes context sometimes, but quite small in climate scale, and maybe does provide, and I think Francis talked about the objectives there about testing and learning, and I think that does provide this scale for identifying, the smaller scale for testing and learning, and I think that's an objective that Francis talked about. So where there is a value add here, and we're not about trying to do the massive scale that's been done by other financing, other approaches, but it is a bit more on the learning and testing. If I have Francis's presentation right, yeah.
Could I say something to address that gentleman's point? I think his point was less about scaling, but it was partly about funding. So I think the key is I'll just say the UK government or actors who may have passed through funding or other funding in the UK. He was looking at I think the local context of the work that's being done outside of large scale projects, and is there funding in I could answer in the US context, but that won't help the gentleman. So, is there funding in the UK or international funding that is targeted on smaller projects where learning is the focus that can be scaled before it is scaled? So I think it wasn't just about scaling the project, but what I heard, and I could be wrong, is there funding for smaller scale innovative projects that are focused on learning? And so maybe Ben or Francis, you could answer that question about what that landscape is in the UK context.
Well, I think that is what I think the fund that Francis talked about would be doing, testing and learning in the international context. Yeah.
In international, I think maybe one thing to say is that there are a variety of projects out there, and I don't know if there's a self-aware community of practice that is learning, and because when I was just doing a bit of research, I could identify relatively smaller scale kind of pilots, but also larger scale initiatives. The Universal Energy Facility run by SE4All is doing kind of relatively large things across a number of countries, and they're translating the model in each market that they enter and engaging stakeholders there, and there are probably tweaks that they make each time. And so there are kind of groups out there that have a lot of vital information, and maybe if they kind of could come together through forums such as these and others, and maybe kind of new programming that we're developing or others can support that, but could help us kind of make sure that we are sharing what we are learning.
Great, thanks all. Was there a question there from Eleanor? And we've got a couple here. Is there anything online as well, Franzi, at the moment? Okay, go with Eleanor first.
Thank you, and thank you for all your speeches. I wanted to ask a bit about community agency, not just being listened to, but being actively involved in any policies or processes that are implemented. And how can we ensure communities are involved in any actions that are taken? They are part of the actioning as well. So how can they not just hold agencies accountable, but be part of the action? Thank you.
That seems like a natural one for Patsy or Creed to come in on, at least in the first instance.
Yeah, Creed, I'll let you take that first.
I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges, right? Because some of the most important communities as far as gaining involvement here are the marginalized, the communities that by nature, by experience, distrust the actors that are making these decisions. So I think to a large extent, it's kind of reformatting the process, right? Giving a fundamental process that can be trusted, if not the outcomes, so that it's kind of a procedural and distributive justice issue. At the end of the day, unfair distributions can be kind of understood or accepted if procedure is more fair. And so I think creating access points and then processes where the views of those communities are actually translated. And it's just a matter of seeing it happen over time, having a consistent process that can be trusted, that we kind of get to peer inside the black box of policymaking that is usually kind of hidden from the general public by stakeholders. So I think that's the first level of it, is just fundamentally changing the process and the access points to the process. And that's just a time issue.
Yeah, and to add to that about the process, I think it's important to think about, how can you use random sampling? So in the deliberative process, which is our second stage, it is to use a citizen assembly, which uses a sortition process, which first will use random sampling to get a representative sample of the population. But if that's not achieved with marginalized groups, then it is to look at other methods like purposive sampling, et cetera, to bring in voices that aren't heard. So in the context of where we're working initially in the US, it is largely bringing in Hispanic voices, many persons who are undocumented and fearful of engaging in public processes like this. So it is relying also on trusted insiders to bring people into the process. And so to your point, which is a great question, it is, having, and to Creed's point, is having a process in place that has multiple points of access where people feel safe to engage, and using professional facilitators, not just us, to engage in that process, who actually are boots on the ground and have high success in doing this. And I hope that answers your question.
Thanks both. And I can plug as well this afternoon a session on inclusion of marginalized communities in these partnerships. So we have a whole session on that. Please quickly, because I want to make sure at least an online person can come in.
Yes, just very quickly.
Yeah.
Adding to what Patsy and Cree were saying, I would add, be careful about how you design the process of engaging and involving, which sounds a bit like the obvious. But for instance, I saw very recently in the municipality of Milan, they have been implementing a very well-designed, apparently, process for the establishment of a citizens' assembly on climate, which I think is something that many cities are doing. So it's very well designed, involving citizens. They have been sampling citizens and then sending invitations and so on. And citizens are working on proposing ideas and deciding, not really deciding actually, but making projects and proposals. Then the municipality said very clearly that actually the final decision rests with the municipal government. So in theory, the citizens know, but in the end, if the municipality's decisions will not take into account to what extent, well, we'll see what the citizens are proposing. Then, of course, the citizens who have spent energy, time in doing this effort will be disappointed. possibly angry, and we lose trust. So, and this is something which it's obvious, but then you see also actors like the Municipality of Milan, which has a long experience in involving citizens. Maybe I wonder how much they have considered this possible drawback.
Just real quickly to that point, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think that's the important point of your presentation, is having the public actor involved. And so it's essential that the public actor will want that voice and, may make an agreement up front to adopt the citizen voice. So there is a lot of back end work, in addition to the design process.
Thanks, Benedetta. Thanks, Patsy. Franzi, if there's one online, can we take one online? And then also there was one here. Let's take them both, and this might be the final questions. Let's see.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Loris, who is from Uplink from the World Economic Forum. And his question is, on a micro level, how do you assess the role of startups in addressing the climate crisis? And are there any programs you would like to mention that in cooperation with international organizations or NGOs provide funding and business support to startups working in this sector?
That's crazy.
Yes, hello. Lara Hirschhausen from UK government. So I had a question for Ben, actually. Within your model and your work, have you looked at skills at all, particularly at skills? So availability of a kind of local expertise skills, but also kind of supporting the development of that, obviously talking about like social benefits and also scaling within that context. So if you could elaborate on that, that'd be great.
Sure.
Do you want to take that one since it's directed?
Sure, thank you. And I can probably answer the other one too, sort of together. Yeah, I mean, to a great point, actually, one of the slides we skipped was on the sort of complementary strategies that you'd be thinking about to not just go with full finance. We can't rely on that totally. And yes, you would have. So I think we haven't dived deep into it. I mean, but that is an important topic. And I think, yeah, something like, say, cement decarbonisation, there are capacity gaps and knowledge gaps that you would have to plug, and that we think should be complemented by a range of other sort of investments. Indeed, there are many things going on those things, and I think the pool finance, and if I'd got a bit deeper into it, we'd talk about like sort of one element of a broader suite. And like say, talking with the EBRD yesterday about these topics, they set up transactions that cover these things. They do look at like technical assistance and skills that you want to bring together, and pool finance can be one element of that in the package, which also just relates to the question online as well around like the types of support. I mean, I think some of the programs Francis was talking about would respond to those needs. I mean, are about supporting startups and new technologies and new ventures and things like. So we've done some research related to Francis's work as well around things like, say, electric mobility, and there's a range of startups on those topics like electric motorbikes in Kenya and Colombia we've looked into, and they're accessing sort of a range of different supports. Yeah, I mean, that's a detailed question, I guess, of listing off the types of different places, but they are there. And I think some of the things Francis mentioned, actually, the programs respond to that as well. But yeah, skills gaps as well relate to those points. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Francis, do you want to comment on the startups question?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really important question. And I think one of the takeaways we had was that solutions can come from anywhere. Mm-hmm. And startups are often some of the most creative places for these kind of new ideas and kind of spotting opportunities on the ground where there are gaps and there are local needs. And so there are probably a whole range of examples that I may or may not be aware of. One thing that came to mind was in our climate innovation portfolio, actually a program led by my colleague Lara, who's in the room. We have a platform called the Clean Energy Innovation Facility, which has funded a partnership with the International Climate Finance Corporation on a kind of tech emerge matchmaking scheme. And last year we met a range of innovators who had kind of partnered across nations to come up with innovative solutions. Many of those initiators were startups. So one example was there was a kind of matchmaking between, I think they were a European kind of outdoor company that had this kind of sustainable cooling solution. And there was a Nigerian startup that wanted a solution to be able to kind of transport fresh goods, agricultural goods in kind of rural communities in Nigeria. They were able to kind of matchmake, adopt, adapt, and develop the solution such that it was kind of suited to that local market and that local need. And it was really kind of achieving some really important outcomes locally. So that those kind of partnerships through the private sector, through startups, can generate some really interesting innovations that have a huge amount of kind of social value.
Thanks, Francis. Patty, did you want to, please quickly.
I just real quickly, cement decarbonization, while it's a wonderful technological outcome, the location matters. And in the context of the Southern San Joaquin Valley, the locations of these facilities have been under marginalized communities who have not had a voice in the process, which is where we again see the social, environmental, technological issue. And just messaging the science has failed in our community. So I just wanted to add that as well.
That's perfect. Thanks so much. Sorry, so we're not going to be able to get to the question, but as you're in person, you can come up and ask the panelists directly afterwards. There should be a feedback link posted in the chat for anyone online or who's on the call. Please do fill that out with any feedback you may have. Coming up next, I'm delighted to say that lunch is the next portion of the day, and then we'll be restarting again with another set of deep dives from 2 p.m. All that remains then is to thank the panel once again. Thanks for your presentations, thanks for your sponsors, and a round of applause for our panel.